There are moments in history when diplomacy becomes more than words. When behind closed doors, deals begin to form, not from handshakes, but from power. In the summer of 2025, global attention shifted once more to Washington, not because of a scheduled summit, but because of what was unsaid, what was implied, and what was rapidly developing between three men: President Donald Trump, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The possibility of a peace summit was no longer speculative. It was, according to Trump himself, a very good prospect. But there was no confirmed location, no confirmed date, only the impression of progress. Trump's tone, during a press exchange, was ambiguous, yet deliberate. He spoke of very good talks with President Putin, of a road that had been long, one that continues to stretch forward, but that now may be approaching its final chapter. The war in Ukraine, by 2025, had entered its third brutal year. Estimates suggest that Russia had lost more than 20,000 soldiers in just the first half of the year. Ukraine, approximately 9,000. Cities continued to be bombarded. Missiles targeted civilian infrastructure. And while American troops were not physically deployed on the ground, Washington's strategic weight had never been heavier. Trump made a critical statement. "This is not my war," he said. He emphasized that during his first term, from 2017 to 2021, no land was taken by Russia. No invasion had occurred. He attributed the current conflict to what he called Biden's war. He did not frame this conflict purely as a tragedy, but as a preventable one. One that, in his words, would never have started under his leadership. This framing is not just about political contrast. It is part of a broader messaging campaign, one designed to reinforce Trump's claim to global strategic competence and to frame the Biden administration's foreign policy as a failure, particularly in deterrence. Yet even as he distanced himself from the origins of the conflict, Trump leaned heavily into its potential conclusion. The conversation shifted toward military capability, a subtle, yet unmistakable flex. Trump spoke at length about the operation that, under his command, had allegedly obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons capability. He described it in precise detail: a 48-hour operation, 52 tankers in the air, a B-2 stealth bomber flying for 36 continuous hours, surrounded by F-22s and F-35s, Tomahawk missiles, launched from a submarine chasseur, every missile, every bomb, hitting its target. To the untrained listener, this may have sounded like a tangent, but geopolitically, it was a message. This was not about Iran. This was about Russia, and about sending a signal, the reminder of American reach, American precision, and American capacity for rapid, overwhelming force was not incidental. And in that context, the mention of a newly ordered line of enhanced B-2 bombers was more than ceremonial. It was strategic theater. Even the act of showing off a scale model of the new aircraft during the press conference was part of the choreography. It sent a signal both to allies and adversaries that despite the absence of boots on the ground, the United States remained, as Trump asserted, the most capable military power on earth. But military might alone does not end wars. It only shifts the balance of negotiation, which is where the situation becomes more nuanced. Trump's announcement of a 50% tariff on oil imports from India, the world's second largest buyer of Russian oil, was not framed as a direct pressure point. He casually remarked, "I do not know if that had anything to do with it." But strategically, the implications are clear. By cutting into India's economic incentive to buy discounted Russian crude, Washington indirectly targeted one of Moscow's few remaining financial lifelines. At the same time, it forced New Delhi into a recalibration of its energy calculus, without explicitly punishing India in broader diplomatic terms. This was not mere trade policy. It was economic statecraft. Trump framed this as progress, but stopped short of calling it a breakthrough. There was hesitation in his tone, a deliberate refusal to express full confidence. He said he had been disappointed before, and that, this time, caution was warranted. The statement was less about humility and more about strategic ambiguity. To appear optimistic without offering leverage, to signal strength without promising outcome. This approach has historical precedent. Throughout the Cold War, arms negotiations and ceasefire arrangements often began under similar conditions. Unannounced talks, carefully chosen language, mutual signaling through proxies, tariffs, or even military maneuvers. And, in this case, the potential summit between Putin and Zelensky, brokered or hosted by Trump, would represent not only a diplomatic climax to the Ukraine war, but a reframing of American leadership under his second term. It would be both ceasefire and vindication. A peace deal or even a face-to-face agreement on steps toward de-escalation would allow Trump to campaign, not just as a former president who kept the peace, but as a sitting president who restored it. Yet, behind that narrative lies the geopolitical reality. Russia's losses have been staggering. 20,000 troops in 6 months is a hemorrhage that even Moscow's vast reserves cannot sustain indefinitely. Domestic unrest, though suppressed, has been increasing. Conscription policies are being quietly expanded. And while the Kremlin has maintained its messaging discipline, the cost is becoming harder to hide. Ukraine, on the other hand, remains resilient, but reliant. The defense lines in the Donbass, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia regions are stretched. Western aid continues to flow, but with growing fatigue among European partners, especially as internal politics shift in capitals like Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. The United States remains the backbone of Ukrainian resistance. But Trump's pivot toward ending the war and his emphasis on reducing overseas entanglements may reshape that posture. If peace talks do materialize, the question becomes not simply when or where, but at what cost, and to whom. What concessions would be required of Zelensky? What guarantees would be given to Putin? Would territory already lost remain under Russian control? Would sanctions be lifted in exchange for ceasefire verification? And above all, would such a deal hold? Trump, when pressed, refused to answer whether Putin was negotiating in good faith. He said, "I will tell you in a matter of weeks, maybe less." That vagueness, that strategic delay, is again part of the process. Information is power. And in geopolitics, timing is leverage. The broader picture is not only about Ukraine, but about realigning the global order. A peace summit would not just bring the war to a potential pause. It would reposition the United States at the center of Eurasian diplomacy. It would signal that Washington, not Brussels, not Beijing, and certainly not the United Nations, remains the ultimate broker of outcomes in modern warfare. The message to China is unmistakable. As Beijing watches Washington dictate the terms of peace in Ukraine, it must now reconsider its ambitions in the Taiwan Strait, its encroachments in the South China Sea, and its expanding military infrastructure across Asia. Because if the United States can, through tariffs, arms posturing, and diplomatic leverage, force Russia into compromise, then China will be next in the calculus. And in that scenario, the alliances of the 21st century will be reshaped not by ideology, but by energy dependency, by military capacity, and by economic pressure. India, as a case in point, now sits uncomfortably in the middle. Its reliance on Russian oil was both strategic and economic. But the new tariffs mean that continued trade with Moscow comes at a price. Not just financial, but diplomatic. The recalibration of India's foreign policy, under pressure from Washington, signals a new kind of diplomacy, one driven less by coalition building and more by transactional force. This is the world Trump is shaping. A world where peace is not the absence of war, but the result of deals, leverage, and deterrence. If the summit between Putin and Zelensky occurs, and if it leads to even a temporary cessation of hostilities, it will be framed as a triumph. But behind every triumph lies a trade-off. Some territory will remain disputed. Some soldiers will have died for ground that may now be surrendered. Some alliances will feel betrayed. But in the cold calculus of global power, this is how peace is forged, not through idealism, but through pressure, precision, and power. Trump understands this, and his strategy reflects it. As the world waits for confirmation of the summit, the real negotiations are already underway. In phone calls, in sanctions, in deployments, and in tariffs, like the 50% one imposed on India. These are not accidents of policy. They are instruments of strategy. And in that strategy, the end of the road may finally be in sight. But whether it is an end worth celebrating, or merely the beginning of a new phase in the global contest for influence, remains to be seen, because in international affairs, there is no true peace, only pauses before the next round begins.